Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now, here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We are now close to ending our second season, but we remain just as excited as ever to continue to help you explore and understand the unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. Here we look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung and heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we interview experts for today's show on environmental justice and social equity, focusing on the economics of environmental justice. Locating polluting facilities in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color means that people with marginalized identities experience more asthma, a greater likelihood of heart attacks, and even premature death. And this disadvantage that comes with these health issues, like missing school, creating a cycle of poverty, and lack of access to opportunity that spans generations even, and shapes every part of the experience of being a person of color or low income in the United States. And as our society becomes more interconnected, the impacts of this situation are increasingly spreading to everyone in unintended and unthought of ways, as the current COVID pandemic has and is clearly showing us. Americans pride ourselves on our efforts to achieve equity in many respects. We call for gender, age, ethnic, racial, and religious equity in areas such as education, employment, and leadership opportunities. And people who have historically been discriminated against, such as women, minorities, the elderly, persons with disabilities, are now protected in the workplace by laws such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Title VII of the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission Act. News headlines, though, often report the latest strides made on behalf of the less fortunate in our society. The attraction of the American dream lies in the belief that despite initial circumstances, all people are essentially created equal and therefore have the opportunity to achieve success. But what if you were born into what has been called one of the national sacrificial areas, where the risk that you will be born with birth defects or develop serious health problems is greatly increased because your neighborhood is a dumping ground for any variety of noxious substances? Over the past 10 years, an expanding body of literature, including books, journal articles, newspaper stories, and more, have been relaying account after account of environmental horrors, where victims of varying ages are all characterized by minority or low-income status. The 80 miles of the lower Mississippi River that lies between New Orleans and Baton Rouge has been dubbed Cancer Alley, and more recently, it's Flooding Alley, because the area's oil refineries and petrochemical plants, numbering more than 100, have polluted the air, they have polluted the land, and they have polluted the water. West Harlem, New York, hosts a crematorium, 2 bus depots, a marine garbage transfer station, a 6-lane highway, a commuter rail line, a highway used for transporting hazardous waste through New York City, and a regularly malfunctioning sewage plant, which processes 180 million gallons plus of sewage daily. In the southeastern Chicago housing project of Atgill Gardens, residents have claimed they're living in a toxic donut. The project was built on top of a former landfill, and several noxious facilities such as hazardous waste incinerator, 7 landfills, chemical plants, a paint factory, contaminated lagoons, and a sludge drying facility have been named as the source or sources of the high cancer rate, birth defects, and other health and respiratory problems cropping up among the 10,000 inhabitants. These and other similar narratives continue to inspire what seems to be the never going to end movement in the United States, the call for environmental justice. And this movement of environmental justice has been steadily gaining momentum instead of decreasing the need for it since the 1980s. From the perspective of economists, the economic motivation for examining environmental justice lies in determining the extent to which environmental discrimination results in inefficiency. And this is not certainly meant to suggest that the issue of fairness or equity is irrelevant. Rather, economics is primarily concerned with markets and market efficiency. And so the economic efficiency is a significant tool that policymakers, the business community, and you and I use to enhance our decision-making process and, more importantly, to activate changes in our behavior. And so, by examining the possible sources of market inefficiencies caused by environmental justice, a framework and greater motivation for correcting the market failures can be established. And of course, the problem and the problems associated with environmental justice issues are multifaceted. This can probably be viewed from a general or as a general equilibrium problem, in the sense that one has to identify the efficient levels of all the various pollutants simultaneously. For example, changing the level of one pollutant results in a ripple effect that involves other markets and other pollutants. For example, further, consider a situation in which policymakers want to reduce automobile emissions. They set the price of gasoline at a level that will dissuade a number of drivers from driving, or so they think. And this reduction in the number of cars operating, in turn, achieves the target level of gasoline emissions being lowered. But while the efficient level of car emissions can be achieved, other markets and pollutant levels may be affected. For example, with a number of consumers of automobiles declining, then car manufacturers may decrease production, which in turn, of course, is going to decrease the amount of pollution from the manufacturing process. And so the level of the industrial pollution associated with car manufacturing decreases also, as well as the amount of car emissions. However, another pollutant that may be affected, although somewhat differently, is diesel emissions. If former drivers decide to take public transportation, such as diesel-powered buses and many other diesel-powered modes, then the number of buses operating and those others may increase. And as the number of diesel-fueled automotives increase, then the amount of diesel films are going to increase. Another source of market inefficiencies is that perfect information concerning the benefits and cost of noxious facilities is often not totally available in the real world. But even with this, the health impacts will and have continued to bring to light the fact that the market and economic efficiencies do exist. This is a lot. So here today to help us understand some of this is Professor Sheila Foster. Sheila is the Scott Ginsberg Professor of Urban Law and Policy at Georgetown University. She holds a joint appointment with the Georgetown Law School and the McCourt Public Policy School. Prior to joining Georgetown, Sheila was a professor and the Albert Walsh Professor of Real Estate, Land Use, and Property Law at Fordham University, where she co-chaired the Fordham Urban Law Center and was a founder of the Fordham University Urban Consortium. Prior to joining Fordham, Sheila was a professor of law at Rutgers University in Camden, New Jersey. Sheila writes in the areas of property, land use, environmental justice, and local government law. She also was the chair of the advisory committee of the Global Parliament of Mayors from 2017 to 2020 and serves as co-chair of the Equity Work Group on the New York City Mayor's Panel on Climate Change. Sheila also co-directs LabGov, which is an international applied research project that works directly with local governments to craft, implement, and evaluate new policies that enable city residents to steward land and other resources within their own community. Welcome, Sheila. Thank you so much for being here. We are very glad that you could join us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're happy because we know that university professors such as yourself are particularly busy going back to in-person learning in this age of COVID and all that it entails. So, again, thank you.
Indeed. Thanks.
Sheila, let's start by talking about what you would say are the major sources of environmental justice issues or environmental injustice issues and concerns in our country today.
So you covered many of them in your opening remarks, and I will also say this varies by region, right? So in the Northeast, for instance, there's a lot of polluting facilities that burn, trash or that generate energy. In the West, there's some of that, but you might have farm workers overexposed to pesticides, et cetera. And then there's a whole host of issues with regard to indoor contamination. People who live in old housing are exposed to lead. People who live in communities that were mixed commercial industrial communities, mainly African Americans and others who were zoned into those communities, there's contaminated soil because those companies have left and never cleaned up.
And I'm going to stop you right there, and we'll continue to travel around the country and visit their various environmental injustice issues after the break. We are going to go to break now, and we want to give a shout-out to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Market, Sunflower Shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free online at nadallas.com. Our other sponsors, North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsors, Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, none mercury, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on environmental justice and social equity as we examine the aspects of the economics of environmental justice or environmental injustice. And we are back with Professor Sheila Foster, who is with Georgetown University Law Center, who specializes in areas of property, land use, environmental justice, and local government law. And we are just so elated we could get her from her busy professorial schedule right now. So again, thank you. And Sheila, right before the break, you were traveling around the country telling us about the various instances or sources of environmental injustice. And I think that's important. Thank you for pointing that out, but it does vary by region. And hopefully people will realize just because maybe lead is not the hot issue in our region, we still got some of those issues.
That's right. And I think overlaid on top of all of that, those what I would call legacy environmental justice issues or legacy pollutants in many communities are climate change impacts now, right? So you have many communities that if they're flooded and they're already contaminated, not only are they overexposed to the contamination that is now coming into their homes or in their groundwater, but it's a threat actually to other communities who may not think that that they're at risk from the contamination in a neighboring community. Or, for instance, heat waves, right? If you're in a community with poor air quality because of high levels of contamination, or you live close, as many communities of color do, to highways, then imagine on days of 100 plus temperatures that the respiratory and other issues that are threatening those communities are even worse. So we now talk about not just environmental injustice, but climate injustice, right?
Yeah, people say environmental justice and social equity, and I'll coin my own term, the social equity of climate change, because it's an equal opportunity issue. As we talked about on our show last week, it's just that the responses and perhaps some of the impacts are exacerbated.
Correct.
Therein lies the environmental justice issues, but climate change is turning out to be the great equalizer.
Yes and no, right? I mean, we know that when it hits, it will hit us randomly, right? I mean, it is a neutral force, so I think that's right. Climate change is a threat to all of us, but it lands on an unequal landscape, right? And that's where you see the differing impacts. And so we've seen it with Ida, we saw it with Katrina, we saw it with Harvey, and we'll continue to see it. But not just the storms, but also, again, the heat waves and the other weird weather patterns that we see with climate change.
Indeed. And as you were going around the country on your walk of environmental injustices, one of the things that came to mind was fracking, which initially and typically is seen as a Texas issue. But the more I read, I see that that is not at all the case. Texas, maybe because it was more widespread, I don't know, or it may be because our citizens, it hit areas that were not typical vulnerable areas here in Texas. And I think as a result, those people went to the mat and they actually got local laws passed.
Well, and Pennsylvania is a hot spot for this, right? Pennsylvania has one of the largest shales. And not only did local governments try to ban fracking, but the state overrode.
Ours did too.
But in the Pennsylvania state constitution, there's a right to the environment, to a clean environment. And so the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, again, imposed on the state a public trust obligation that the state is the trustee of our natural environment. So the fracking issues and all of these issues actually play out very differently in 50 states because we have 50 state laws and 50 state constitutions and also different policies, not just at the state, but increasingly at the local level. In fact, I just wrote a blog post today on the state and local government blog called Slog Blog on how states and cities are responding to climate change.
Interesting. And that goes in with the next thing I want to ask you, and that's how has this changed over the last 20 years or so? And I'm sensing that it has maybe a lot to do with people like you and the work that you do with local governments.
Well, and I think there are a lot of community-based activists and organizations who have been, so you mentioned Harlem, for instance, a lot of the environmental justice policies and laws came out of these neighborhood resident-led movements against the placement of bad things in their neighborhoods, polluting things. And these organizations have really worked with federal, state, and local governments over time and experts like myself, right, to put in place the policies that will help them. So President Bill Clinton signed a federal executive order on environmental justice in 1994. Most people don't know that, directing every federal agency to make sure their policies do not have a disparate impact on low-income populations and communities of color, what we now call today our frontline communities. So yes, this issue has been brought to the forefront of our legal and policymaking institutions and even presidents to their agendas by activists, by academics who bring science and empirics to this. As well as, I think, increasingly the media. And that's really been more, I think, recent, is the media coverage.
Yes.
Because this is a movement that's now 30 or so years old.
Hasn't it been exciting to hear on the news when they talk about the wildfires, they use the term climate change in the same sentence?
Yes, both climate change and also environmental justice. I was speaking about environmental justice has in the past, it's been around for 30 years, but in the past 10 years or 5 years and even more today because President Biden has made it a priority in his administration, but also climate change, right? I mean, Al Gore talked about climate change years ago, but hardly anyone was listening. But I think climate change, we're paying more attention because more people are impacted. If you look at the wildfires, if you look at just last week, the flooding, the extent of the impacts, it's no longer just one hurricane every 10 years like Katrina. It's now we're seeing 100, 200, 500-year projections now happen every 5 to 10 years. And they're massive events that impact a lot of people. That's why I think we're paying attention to climate change more.
I've loved it because they keep connecting them, because that connection has to keep happening for people to really internalize it and not forget about it the moment the event is gone.
That's correct. Well, the devastation is so it's so extensive now. Again, look at the wildfires. I mean, these are that it's hard to forget if whole communities are being decimated.
It really is. And an interesting thing, too, like with the wildfires, was fairly equal opportunity.
Yes.
It may not have been equal opportunity in terms of who got back up first and where they went,
right.
but it was equal opportunity in terms of who got burned down. I see a similar thing in some of our coastal communities as well. You know, I lived in South Florida for a long time, as you did, and what I noticed all over Florida is that the wealthier on the coastlines and the lower income are inside, and it's typically those coastlines that get flooded.
Correct. So now what we're seeing, and there are a couple of new studies out on this, looking at the empirics of what's now called climate gentrification, because the wealthy are moving inland, right? Because they're hedging their risk and they're moving to places away from the coast like Little Haiti. And the property values in those communities are going up as a result, and many of the legacy residents can no longer afford to live there. So what we see is, in part, some managed retreat from the coast. There are some states, not Florida, and local governments that are trying to actually manage people moving away from risk and repopulating them elsewhere. But a lot of this is happening as a function of the market, that people are saying, I'm at risk of flooding, and I'm right in harm's way, and so my property values aren't going to hold it. I'm going to sell now and get out and go to higher land.
So I wonder, does that mean as the higher income move back to the urban core, that they'll push the vulnerable communities back out to the coastlines where they get flooded out? That should be interesting to see how that's going to pan out.
They're not pushing them to the coastline. They're pushing them to other less desirable communities. Right now, that's a lot of inner ring suburbs in some places.
Yeah, the first suburbs that are now, we used to call them in urban planning exurbs.
Yeah. So these are the inner ring suburbs where 40 years ago, people were fleeing out of cities to buy in. Now their infrastructure hasn't been kept up as well, and so now they're available and more affordable to recent immigrants, as well as people who can no longer afford the urban core, because we see this kind of demographic inversion.
Indeed. Sheila, you talked a little bit about it, but I want to talk about the role of laws in these changes and what the future of law is, or you envision, in helping out with environmental justice. For example, one of the things you mentioned earlier before we went to the break even, you were mentioning how the fracking law, where I know here in North Texas, our citizens in Denton enacted a law, but the governor overturned it, and you were saying the same or similar thing happened in Pennsylvania, but they had a law in place so that theirs couldn't get overturned. Is that correct?
Well, no, the state preempted. So there's, you've probably heard of this because it's happening all over the country. Local governments try to put in place a law. Let's say we want to move away from fossil fuel energy to renewables, or we want to ban fracking for health reasons, or, we want to stop putting certain polluting facilities in or concentrating them in certain neighborhoods. And local governments often have the authority to do that, but the problem is that states can overrule them. Why is that? Because local governments are not mentioned in the federal Constitution. All the powers that they receive from their states. And so even when they have strong local power, what we call home rule, the states can preempt them and overrule them, and sometimes what we call now punitive preemption, as Texas did, for instance, with regard to sanctuary cities, the states can punish them by either fining them or even threatening to arrest the local officials who carry out the local law that they don't like.
Oh, my. So Pennsylvania, indeed, their fracking law got preempted also?
Yes, but then it's complicated. But then there was an appeal to the Supreme Court over oil and gas leases, not the fracking, but it has implications for fracking, where the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said, actually, there's a right to health and environment in our Constitution. And so the state is limited in what it can do.
Okay, so they kind of got around it. Maybe we can find that way around, too. Very interesting conversation. We're going to go to break now, and we will be back for Professor Sheila Fawcett to make us all much smarter. Thank you, Sheila. We'll be back. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. To our show today on environmental justice or injustice and social equity, looking at the economics of environmental justice. And we are back with Professor Sheila Foster from Georgetown University Law Center, and she is really helping us understand and giving us a lot of valuable information about the ins and outs of environmental justice and how it impacts these vulnerable communities, but increasingly it's impacting everyone. And so, again, thank you, Sheila, for taking time. Right before the break, we were talking about the role of law and laws in some of the changes and perhaps some of the protections as it relates to environmental justice or injustice issues. And my question was, what do you see as the future in terms of how laws can help with this? Because this has been a long journey. It's picking up, and that's a good thing, but got to come to a point when it begins to take.
Well, yeah, that's right. And so we've talked about the state and local level, and there's been a patchwork of approaches because we have 50 different states and 50 different approaches in 100,000 local governments. And so that it's like climate change. That can't be the full answer, right? Because this is a problem that impacts all of us, even if you don't think you're impacted. You'll be surprised in the ways that you are impacted, and you will only find that out after you're impacted. So therefore, we need federal leadership, and that's been lacking under many administrations. But I think the future is perhaps the beginning of the future is perhaps starting with this current administration. President Biden and his administration has really put environmental justice at the core of what they're doing on infrastructure, on the energy transition, and on aid to states and localities and communities. I can say more about that, but I do think that the initiatives, he has something called the Justice 40 initiative, where 40% of the funds that he's going to spend will go to environmental justice communities. It doesn't say that exactly in the law, but are designed to go to the most vulnerable communities. So that's the kind of, it's less about a command approach from law, you must do this, or directing states and localities, but about giving resources so that these communities can clean up, can become sustainable, and also prevent some of these bad things from happening in the future. So I think there's a lot happening at the federal level, and that's right now where it looks like a lot of reform is happening.
And that is interesting because as that happens, we may get some trickle down, because I'm also seeing from our conversation earlier that we need to do some things at the state level. Well, we kind of see that from some other issues that are going on in our society today, too. And that is get some laws enacted at the state level which cannot be overturned and which will protect us as well. And maybe this push down from the feds can help to accomplish some of that.
Well, it will, because one of the ways that the federal government operates vis-a-vis the states is that it attaches conditions to money. Mm-hmm. And so if the state wants the money, think about Obamacare, right? A lot of states rejected it, the extra, but if the states want the money, then these obligations will flow with that, right? And so in that sense, it's designed to go all the way down to the local governments.
I wonder, too, as you're saying that, I'm reminded of, and it may not be workable, it's probably not workable, but to attach some federal requirements to FEMA as they're going in. On one hand, they need to provide relief to people hit right now. But I'm wondering, we've got a lot of smart people like yourself to figure out a way to make some connections there.
So one of the things that I think is very obscure or opaque to many people is how the federal administrative state works. And FEMA and the Department of Energy and the CDC and all these other agencies exert a tremendous amount of influence over our lives, usually through money, again. Yep. And so I do think that with the political appointees, let's say, the people that have been brought in this administration with the kinds of commitments, that kind of thinking is happening, I think, across the board throughout all these agencies. And the thinking, to be clear, is to focus on particularly vulnerable populations and communities with regard to whether it's health or the environment or energy costs, for instance. There's something called energy justice now, right?
Right.
That all of these issues are things that can be partially addressed through the federal grants and aids and the conditions and the incentives, the kind of carrots, not the sticks of regulation.
Typically, these environmental justice issues can be quantified in terms of health and mortality, land use and property values, and displacement. But before we dig into each of those, are there other ways or places we should be looking at to quantify environmental justice issues and impacts?
They have been quantified in all of those ways. One of the things that some economists have written about is the things that we can't quantify. That are lost. So people's social ties and their sense of community, for instance, levels of happiness. And so even from within the framework that you've set out here, the market-based economic framework, I think a lot actually has been quantified, but there's quantification in and of itself doesn't often give us the full picture of cost. Yeah. We also know that the market is not always, you talked about efficiency, but we're not always rational actors. And so there's a whole body of economic thought called behavioral law in economics. For instance, when people should give up something because it's rational to, often they hold on to it. It's called the endowment effect. So people's behavior in this space is really, I think, it's interesting to look at why we make the choices we do, even when there's inefficiency. So that's something I think we can further, that there's more to be done there. So that's really the answer to your question. There's been a lot of quantification, but it's an imperfect art and science.
I think all of us see we are increasingly and rapidly getting to the point where we can't ignore.
Well, that's right. And I think people are overwhelmed at the risk calculus, first of all. It's like COVID. What really is my risk? And, eating outside versus going inside, or in a crowd of people who are masked outside versus unmasked. And the same with environmental risk. People are really overwhelmed with climate and other risks. They don't know how to think about their risk and also what to do about it, because they think, well, what can I do about climate change? It's right. What can the average person do? And unless we're telling people, here's what you can do, then it's easier just to set aside the problem and go on with the problems that are right in front of you, your daily challenges.
Indeed. That's why the last question on our show every week is, what can ordinary people do in their everyday lives to help drive solutions? And you know what? You would not believe the number of times that answer comes to be, talk about it. Even in your small chit-chat in the grocery line. That helps drive forward too as well. So, Sheila, I want to examine a little bit with health and mortality. And are there any estimates out there that you might be aware of or can share with us of the health cost of the environmental justice or environmental injustice impacts? And then why should everyone care about this, even though they may not be part of that environmental justice or vulnerable population? That is a real issue with me, is getting the acknowledgement out there that even though I may not be in that vulnerable population or in that location, that it still affects me.
Sure. I could think of two right off the bat. And these are costs. So let's say you're not a part of a community that's directly impacted by environmental injustice, that has a concentration of pollutants. And, you don't have to think about it. But in fact, right, the kid that is sent, or the adult that's sent to the hospital because their communities are overwhelmed by respiratory illnesses, or the kids that have lead poisoning, and it diminishes their capacity to learn and even create certain learning disabilities. When they go to the public hospital or the public school system, we're paying to cover the extra cost of educating a child with learning disabilities, the extra cost of hospitalization for people that don't have health insurance. Typically, if you're in part of these communities, they're low income, you don't have health insurance. These costs are being passed along to taxpayers. And even if you're in a state like, Florida has no state income tax, and you think like, but, I can get around that because I can live in Florida, I can choose my state. And the federal taxes, I'm going to lobby my representative to make sure they don't raise them. Think about the fines and fees that state and local governments impose upon us because they can't tax us more. They're going to get us for all of these costs. These are externalities.
Yes. I'm not sure if Florida is the case, but in some places, hospital districts have taxing authority.
They have taxing authorities, but also every time you get on the Florida Turnpike or all the tolls, so Florida doesn't have income taxes, but there are lots of ways you're taxed in Florida, and it's not called a tax. But the point is that these are things we all ultimately pay for, right? It's Indeed. Like, climate change. We cannot do anything about it, but look how we're paying for it.
And I'm glad you brought that out, because this is very important, because these are what I call the unthought of consequences. There's unintended, and then there's just unthought of, or never would think about that type of consequences that grow, that have meaning, and that certainly can cost money. We're getting ready to go to break. And after we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about this. I call it the devil in the details type thing, these small things that are big, but people don't think about. So we'll be right back on the other side with Professor Sheila Foster, who, again, is just making us much smarter. Thank you. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsors, Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, non-mercury, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on environmental justice and social equity, looking at the economics of environmental justice or environmental injustice. And we are back with Professor Sheila Foster from Georgetown University Law Center, the McCourt School. Yeah, and we've had someone last season from McCourt School as well. You guys do really good work there. So keeping on talking about health costs, and as we were talking about, as they say, the devil is in the details, and this is about the hidden or unnoticed, or as we mentioned earlier, forgotten economic cost, those that most people never think about or that they don't know about, that are related to health, healthcare, and mortality. But using COVID as a real-time example that's familiar to everybody, though the specific ways that COVID-19 attacks the human body are still being discovered, the early consensus is that respiratory and heart ailments are significant risk factors with the virus. And these are conditions also that are often associated with the health effects of environmental racism and other environmental justice issues. And they're likely to cause disparities in COVID-19 cases and deaths. So we talk a little about the economic impacts of COVID-19 and how much of this is attributable to current and perhaps emerging environmental justice or injustice issues and impacts.
Right. So there was a Harvard public health study in the last year, I believe, 2020, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic that found there was a correlation between the geographic areas that had high levels of COVID infection and also had high levels of what we call PM2.5 air pollution, which is really fine type air pollution, particulate matter, the kind of air pollution that studies have established these environmental justice communities, low income, usually communities of color, disproportionately suffer from. So there's a direct link, right, from COVID infection and vulnerability to COVID infection. Another link that I think has not been quite measured is at a time last year when we were told to go outside when the weather was nice, spend time in parks, meet people there. The same communities that are disproportionately burdened with pollutants also are disproportionately or disproportionately lack green amenities like parks, or don't live close to them. And they're also the essential workers that had to get on public transportation. So all of this, I've never seen environmental justice issues as separate from these other social economic issues, including structural inequality that's rooted in our system of land use and property and a lot of other systems, and our healthcare system, the disparities there. So there's a really tight link between a lot of these things, and it's really hard to isolate environmental justice, as we saw with COVID.
Yeah, multifaceted, like we talked about earlier. It's impossible. And I think everyone began to see how interconnected and inextricably connected our societies are, vulnerable population or not. You know, it may have been the vulnerable population that's getting it and dying from COVID-19 more so, but they also provide those essential services, and they are called essential for a reason.
And also, if they're not attended to, we've seen that there's mutation. Yeah. So it eventually comes back around to get us, even if you think, I'm fine, you know, but even if that population is not, well, it turns out, like pollution, these viruses don't respect geographic limits, right? Really and the same with pollution. You know, you put it in the air, it's going to float, right? It'll travel. You put it it leaks into the ground, it might get to your community.
While health is the big issue, I do want to move on, though, and talk a little bit about land use and property values. Because, again, this is one of those things that people don't pay a lot of attention to, and perhaps don't get a lot of information put in their face so that they will pay attention to. So talk to us a little bit, Sheila, about the economic impacts of environmental justice on land use and property values, and how it's affecting everyone. Again, not just the vulnerable classes who do bear the biggest burden.
Sure. I mean, it's obviously anything that reduces the value of your property is going to disadvantage your community, and it's no surprise that if you are in a community with a lot of disamenities, a lot of pollution, your property values go down. But the question you're asking is, what does that do to the rest of the society and the rest of the market? I think in terms of land use, so we are seeing a lot of urban mobility in and out of places. So you saw that with after Katrina coming to Houston because migrants had nowhere to go, the people that were displaced. And so much like COVID and pollution, there are kind of spillover effects. When people are displaced or lose their home because their property values go down, or they can't live there, or they can't leave there, and they start to look for homes in different places, then it does change the places they're coming to, whether that's the inner ring suburb or not. So it does. There are market distortions, though I think they're way too complicated for a short answer.
Right.
But you're right that the immediate impacts, you know, sadly and unfortunately, are really on these communities that are most disadvantaged because they've lost the wealth that was in their property, and therefore they're going to be even further behind in society.
So I want to talk about the growing problem of what we call climate refugees. And many folks, when they hear that term, they immediately think of countries like Africa, parts of the Middle East, and, of course, Latin America. But folks in Texas cities can all tell you about this in terms of what when I was in Florida and I'd come home to visit Texas, they talk about, oh, that's the Katrina refugees. And that kind of thing is increasingly happening. We may even get some from Northeast if they keep having the floods to drive out whole communities. Or we may get some Los Angeles area, Lake Tahoe refugees from the fires. Can you tell us a little bit then about the economic cost of what's being left behind and perhaps the toll on refugee livelihoods and cost to society when this happens increasingly for different extreme weather events and climate events that are only growing?
No, that's right. I mean, in fact, the domestic issue mirrors the international issue in the following respects. There are climate refugees all over the world, but most migration is in country, right? So they're moving from the rural parts of Africa or South America because rural livelihoods are drying up because of climate change, and they're coming into the cities, and the cities are unprepared to deal with them. So you have informal settlements. In our country, there are going to be places of the United States, we're seeing it already, that become virtually uninhabitable. right? It could be Lake Tahoe, it could be Oregon, parts of Oregon, it could be parts of the Northeast, and people are going to migrate. And the problem, as it is with other areas around the world, is absorbing the migrants. No one is ready for the cost of that. None of the governments that are absorbing them, and not the people within them. When your property values rise, or rather property taxes and other costs of living where you living rise because there are more people coming in putting pressure on supply, right? Then we're all going to pay for that because we're not structurally, none of these governments at the local or state level are preparing for it. And it's the exact same with climate change. I mean, so just to go back, Ida that struck New Orleans last week, New Orleans fared a lot better than it did after Katrina with a stronger storm. Why? Because they invested multiple $1 billion in their levee and storm surge and seawall infrastructure. It's the same with migration. We can prepare for it, invest in more people coming in, build more housing, build better infrastructure, or we can let the market just do what it's going to do, and we're all going to pay on the back end.
I sure hope they are preparing in the Northwest, because many of those areas where people are on their second, third fire, they're going to leave. And there needs to be intention about that. Hopefully there is. We only have a minute to go. And so I want to talk about what policy has done and should do, and then what can ordinary people do in their everyday lives to help drive solutions to the problems and impacts of environmental injustice in our country.
So I talked a little bit about policy. I think the most impactful policy will be this infrastructure bill that is pending now in Congress that has climate and environmental infrastructure or issues at their core. Because as we keep seeing, unless we deal with the infrastructure and preparing, it's too late to stop climate change. We have to prepare to take the hard hits and survive. Our communities have to survive. So that's the major policy, is money and infrastructure. What can we do, each of us do? I hate to say this because I know you hear this a lot, but there are, we can recycle, we can do a lot of it, but that's mitigation. And in terms of environmental injustice, we can support policies and leaders that don't want to tolerate that level of injustice and inequality, not just because it's the morally, ethically, and legally right thing to do, but because ultimately we all will pay in the end.
It's coming for all of us.
And so I think that what you can do is support the right policies and leaders that are paying attention to this and raise awareness.
Thank you so much, Sheila. We really appreciate you taking time from your hectic schedule to be with us. We really appreciate this very interesting and useful information that you have imparted to us. We have been with Professor Sheila Foster from the University of Georgetown Law Center and the McCourt School of Public Policy. Thank you. You really have made us smarter today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you, listeners, for listening in to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. The conversation starts here, but our goal is to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is a result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day, like yourselves. And each of them can seem insignificant, but they all add up one way or the other to the change that we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you for being with us today, and join us again next week for more Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. Thank you.